They thought they could take everything from me. My family's farmland, our legacy, my future, all of it sold off by a homeowners association that had no legal right to touch it. But what they didn't know was that I'd been living on this land long before their HOA ever existed. And when I started going through my old records, I found something even better than proof of ownership. What would you do if the very people who stole from you suddenly ended up at your mercy? If you're into outrageous HOA revenge stories, hit that subscribe button, because this one's wild. The morning started like any other. The sun rose over my fields, casting a golden light across the soybeans, swaying gently in the breeze. I had worked this land my entire life, just like my mother and grandfather before me. Our family had owned these acres long before there was even a paved road leading into the nearby town of Clearwater, Texas. That's why, when my phone rang that afternoon, I had no reason to expect anything out of the ordinary. Maybe a supplier confirming delivery, a neighbor borrowing a tool, or one of the farmhands checking in. But instead, it was my attorney, Rachel Knox. Her voice was tight with urgency. "We've got a problem," she said. "The HOA claims they've sold your land." I almost laughed, thinking it was some ridiculous misunderstanding. "That's impossible," I said, stepping out onto the porch and looking out over my fields. "The HOA doesn't own this land. I've never signed anything. My deed is rock solid." There was a long pause on the other end. "You need to get down to the county records office, now. You need to see this for yourself." Within the hour, I was standing in a cramped government office, staring at a thick stack of documents spread across a table. Rachel flipped through them, her expression dark. "This," she said, tapping a stamped page, "is a sales agreement transferring 1,500 acres of your farmland to the Maple Ridge Homeowners Association. According to this, you sold it to them 6 months ago." I almost laughed, thinking it was some ridiculous misunderstanding. "That's impossible," I said, shaking my head in disbelief. "I've never sold anything." Rachel nodded. "I thought so, but take a look at this." She handed me another paper, a signature authorization form, supposedly signed by me, approving the transfer. My stomach turned. The signature looked close, but not quite right. "This is forged," I muttered, fists tightening at my sides. "They faked a sale and think they can get away with it." Rachel sighed, leaning against the counter. "It gets worse. The HOA already sold it to a developer. Construction is scheduled to start next month. If we don't act fast, they're going to bulldoze your land." Her words hit me like a freight train. Over the years, I'd watched the suburban sprawl creep closer. More houses, more roads, but I never thought they'd have the nerve to outright steal my land. This wasn't just property. It was my family's story. It was where my mother taught me how to harvest corn, where my grandfather once raised horses. The idea of seeing it all buried under asphalt and cul-de-sacs made my blood boil. "Who authorized this?" I asked. "Who signed off on this fake sale?" Rachel pointed to the final approval form. "HOA President Kyle Renard, and the notary on the deal, his wife." My jaw clenched. Kyle Renard had always been a smug, power-hungry manipulator, the kind of guy who shook your hand while planning to stab you in the back. Over the years, I'd ignored his petty HOA complaints, letters whining about chemical smells from fertilizer, noise from my irrigation system, even a demand that I visually align my barn with their suburban aesthetic. I never responded. It wasn't worth my time. But this was war. Rachel leaned in and lowered her voice. "We can take this to court. You have the original deed. The sale is fraudulent, so that means we can get the whole deal overturned. But you need to be ready to fight. They won't go down easy." I nodded, already forming a plan. I want every document related to this, every file they submitted, every fake approval. If they think they can steal from me, they're about to learn how wrong they are. Back home, I opened the old safe and laid out the documents my mother had passed down, records proving our family had owned this land for generations, the original deed, the tax filings, the agricultural zoning exemptions. Everything was in perfect order. I called Rachel and told her to start the process. We're stopping this before a single shovel touches my soil. They don't own an inch of this land. But as I flipped through the old records, something unusual caught my eye, a section in the property transfer file I had never noticed before. It referenced an inheritance filing decades ago, when my mother officially took over the land from my grandfather. I ran my finger over the document, reading every word carefully.
And then I saw it. A small notation at the bottom of the page, barely legible in faded ink. A second land parcel, one I had never known about. My heart pounded. I pulled out the old county maps and started cross-referencing them with the deeds. It took me nearly an hour, but when I finally pieced everything together, my anger shifted into something more strategic. This wasn't just about reclaiming what was mine. This was something bigger, something that made the HOA's actions not only reckless, but unbelievably stupid. According to the records, my mother hadn't just inherited the farmland. She had also inherited an additional 300 acres that extended far beyond the boundaries I had always considered our family property. And that extra land, it overlapped with part of the Maple Ridge subdivision, the very neighborhood where the HOA board members lived. I sat back, stunned. They had tried to steal my land, and in doing so, they had overlooked something critical. They were living on land that, legally, still belonged to me. A slow smile crept across my face. This wasn't just a legal fight anymore. This was an opportunity. I closed the folders, my mind racing. The HOA thought they had already won, that I'd either fold, accept a payoff, or get buried in years of court battles. They had no idea what was coming. I picked up my phone and called Rachel. "I change of plans," I said the second she answered. "What kind of change?" she asked, her tone cautious. I stared out over the soybean fields, imagining the look on Kyle Renard's face when he found out the truth. "I mean," I said slowly, "we're going to let them think they've won. And then, when they least expect it, we're going to take everything from them." The next 2 days, I barely slept. I was buried in paperwork, combing through old maps, surveys, and every legal document my mother had ever stored. I analyzed every line like a detective piecing together a cold case. The more I uncovered, the more I realized the truth. My family's land wasn't just intact, it was far larger than I had ever imagined. The records had been there all along, hidden in plain sight, stretching back more than 60 years. My grandfather had originally purchased 1,500 acres for just under $1,000. But tucked into the inheritance documents was an additional 300-acre parcel that had gone untouched for decades. And that parcel? It lay directly beneath the northern section of Maple Ridge, the very same neighborhood that had tried to erase my family's history. The HOA board, Kyle Renard included, had been ruling their little suburban empire on land that legally belonged to me. The realization hit me like a freight train. If I owned that land, then it meant dozens of homes, parts of their winding streets, and even a section of their community clubhouse were built on my property. And the best part? The HOA had never filed the necessary paperwork to legally acquire the land. They had just assumed, when the development expanded, that everything was handled properly. But it wasn't. Either their lawyers were lazy or someone cut corners. And now that mistake was going to cost them dearly. I didn't waste a second. I jumped into my truck and drove straight to Rachel's office, tires kicking up dust as I tore down the gravel road into town. She barely had time to say hello before I dropped the documents onto her desk. "Look at this," I said, my pulse pounding. "Look at the gold mine we just found." Rachel's eyes narrowed as she flipped through the papers, scanning each one with the precision of someone who had lived her life in litigation. Her brow was furrowed. She reached for a zoning map from the county database. "Wait a minute. If this is accurate, your property line extends beyond the northern boundary of Maple Ridge." She looked up, wide-eyed. "Marcus, do you realize what this means?" I leaned in, gripping the edge of the desk. "I know exactly what it means. It means those HOA bastards are living on my land." Rachel let out a low whistle and shook her head. "This is a disaster, a legal catastrophe. If what you're saying checks out, then every homeowner in that part of the subdivision is living on land that was never theirs to begin with." She paused, tapping a pen against the table. "That means their property deeds are invalid. Their mortgages are based on parcels that were never properly transferred. If you wanted to, you could file a claim and take it all back." A slow grin spread across my face. "That's exactly what I plan to do." Rachel leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. "Marcus, this isn't just a lawsuit anymore. You're talking about pulling the rug out from under an entire community. People could lose their homes." I crossed my arms. "They had no problem trying to steal mine. They tried to erase everything my family built. And you think I'm supposed to feel sorry for them?" She exhaled, clearly realizing I couldn't be talked out of it. "So, what's the strategy?" I thought for a moment. "We wait." Rachel blinked. "Wait!" I nodded, mind already racing ahead. Right now, they thought they'd already won. They believed I was scrambling, rushing to put together some weak little lawsuit, trying in vain to stop them from developing my land. But what happens when the people who think they've stolen from you find out they've been building their homes on your property? A slow grin crept across Rachel's face. They'll panic. Exactly. And we'll use that panic. Let them move forward like nothing's wrong. Let them spend their money, sign their contracts, even break ground on my land. Hell, let them pour foundations. I paused. And then we hit them with everything we've got. The next few weeks were brutal. I went through the motions, playing the part of the angry, frustrated farmer fighting a losing battle. All the while, I was quietly setting the stage. I filed the proper paperwork with the county, quietly. No public spectacle. I let the HOA keep sending me violation notices, ridiculous demands about weed height and unauthorized farm equipment. Let them think they had the upper hand. But every moment they believed they were in control, I was getting one step closer to pulling the rug out from under them. Then, one afternoon, I found exactly what I'd been waiting for. A letter arrived in my mailbox. Official notice from the Maple Ridge HOA. The envelope was thick, printed on overpriced paper, and signed with just the right amount of smugness. It was the final confirmation I needed. Dear Mr. Marcus Ellison,
The Maple Ridge Homeowners Association has completed the sale of Parcel 16A to Maple Ridge Development, LLC. As per county regulations, your claims regarding ownership have been reviewed and deemed invalid. Development will proceed as scheduled. Any further disputes may be directed to HOA legal counsel. Effective October 1st, any unauthorized presence on said property will be considered trespassing and prosecuted accordingly. Best regards, Kyle Renard, HOA President. I read it once, then again. Then I laughed so hard I had to sit down. They had just signed their own downfall, in ink. That same night, I filed an official property claim with the county, citing the inheritance clause buried in my family's land records, the one that proved my continued ownership of the additional 300 acres. The moment it was submitted, it triggered a full-scale property review. That meant every single homeowner in that part of Maple Ridge would receive a legal notice. Their deeds were now under dispute. Mortgages would be frozen, insurance policies would be flagged, real estate deals would fall apart. I could only imagine the look on Kyle Renard's face when he got that letter in the mail. The man had spent years using his HOA title like a badge of royalty, bullying anyone who didn't fall in line. He thought he was untouchable, but he made one mistake. He came after me on my land. The next morning, I headed to the county courthouse, where an emergency session had already been called. Word was spreading fast. Homeowners were flooding the HOA office demanding answers. Realtors couldn't close on pending sales. And in the middle of it all was Kyle, pacing the courthouse hallway, pale as a sheet. He saw me the moment I walked in. His expression twisted into fury. "What the hell did you do?" he snapped, storming toward me. I stopped, crossed my arms, smirked. "You sold land that wasn't yours, Kyle, and now you're about to lose everything." His jaw clenched. "This won't hold up in court. The HOA has leverage." I tilted my head slightly. "Oh, I know. That's why I made sure the banks knew before you did." He blinked. "You did what?" I stepped closer. "You know what happens when a deed is flagged as invalid. Mortgages freeze, insurance gets suspended, sales fall through. You tell me, Kyle, what happens when an entire neighborhood suddenly becomes unsellable?" His confidence cracked right in front of me. You wouldn't." "I already did." And then I walked away, leaving him standing there as the walls started to collapse around him. The fight was just beginning, but I already knew how it would end. I wasn't just reclaiming my land. I was about to take their homes, their investments, everything. And when it was over, there wouldn't be a Maple Ridge HOA left to fight me. Over the next month, I laid the groundwork for what would become the most satisfying downfall I'd ever orchestrated. It took patience, restraint, a whole lot of pretending to be defeated. But every second they believed they'd won brought me one step closer to burning their empire to the ground. Kyle Renard and his little band of HOA cronies strutted around like kings, acting like my land already belonged to them, like I was just some stubborn old farmer who didn't know when to quit. What they didn't realize was that every smug grin, every fake violation notice, every letter signed with condescension was just more fuel on the fire I was building beneath their feet. And the first step was letting them stay overconfident. If they suspected for even a moment that I was preparing to dismantle them, they'd go into damage control. I needed them calm, arrogant, oblivious. So I played the part, the angry but powerless landowner. I showed up to HOA meetings shouting about justice, demanding answers I knew they wouldn't give. I let them think I was desperate. Clinging to some fantasy that my land had already slipped through my fingers, I watched Kyle Renard smirking at me from across the room while his board members whispered among themselves, probably exchanging bets on when I'd finally break and accept whatever insult of a settlement they planned to offer once they'd buried me in legal fees. But while I played the role of the desperate farmer for their benefit, I was working behind the scenes. I had already filed my land ownership claim with the county, but that was only step one. I needed more than just documents. I needed proof that the HOA had knowingly acted in bad faith, that they had orchestrated a fraudulent sale, and that Kyle and his board had knowingly authorized construction on land that didn't legally belong to them. So I started talking to people. A lot of people. I went to the Clearwater County Records Office and requested every single document ever filed under Maple Ridge. Most of it was routine development paperwork, construction permits, landscaping approvals, traffic flow plans. But then I hit gold. The HOA board meeting notes. By law, every HOA board meeting had to be documented. Most of the records were vague, sanitized minutes, carefully curated language designed to sound professional. But one entry, tucked deep in the notes from 4 years ago, around the time Maple Ridge first expanded, caught my attention. There had been a brief discussion about a potential zoning irregularity concerning a portion of the northern land. It wasn't detailed, just a note that a discrepancy had been raised and then casually dismissed by the board, who concluded it was unlikely to pose a legal issue. That was my smoking gun. They knew there was a problem, and they went forward anyway. Next, I turned to the residents. Not everyone in Maple Ridge was under Kyle Renard's thumb. In fact, more than a few people were sick of him and his little circle of cronies. I started with Lisa Patterson, one of the first people to buy a home in the expanded part of the neighborhood. She had dealt with years of harassment from the HOA, everything from citations over mailbox paint colors to demands that she repaint her front door because it was too dark and disrupted community harmony. When I showed her what I'd uncovered, her face went pale. "You're telling me my house might not even be legally mine?" she whispered, gripping the edge of her kitchen counter. I nodded. "It's not just you. It's a lot of homes, and the HOA knows it." That was all she needed. She handed me everything. Every letter, every citation, every bizarre high-handed notice the board had ever sent her. She was ready to talk, and I knew word would spread quickly, which was exactly what I wanted. The final piece of the puzzle was the developer. The HOA had sold my land to a construction firm, Ridge Point Developments, but I needed to know how deep the corruption went. I had Rachel dig into their financials, and what she found was better than anything I could have hoped for. The development deal had been rushed, multiple steps skipped, land surveys ignored, zoning approvals fast-tracked, environmental reviews completely bypassed. And the kicker? The company had already secured millions in loans, all based on the projected value of the neighborhood expansion. That meant if my land claim held up, and I knew it would, the entire project would be thrown into chaos, and Ridgepoint would be looking for someone to blame. But while I was building my case, the HOA wasn't sitting still. If they weren't threatening me with bogus fines, they were trying to turn the neighborhood against me. Flyers started appearing in residents' mailboxes, accusing me of trying to steal homes from innocent families and undermine the community's stability. They called me a bitter ex-landowner, lashing out in spite. The audacity of it almost made me laugh. And then one morning, I stepped outside and saw the line had been crossed. The fence along the edge of my property, the entire stretch separating my farmland from the Maple Ridge subdivision, had been torn down overnight. This wasn't vandalism. It was a message. Right at the edge of my property, in all its smug, bureaucratic arrogance, stood a freshly planted HOA sign. Future site of Maple Ridge, Phase 3. I stood there for a long moment, just staring. Then I pulled out my phone, snapped a photo, and texted it straight to Rachel. Me, this is it. They're getting cocky. Rachel, what's the move? Me, we let them bury themselves. The next few weeks were critical. I documented everything, every violation, every threat, every piece of property damage. I hired a private investigator and had him tail a few key board members, capturing some very interesting conversations at the local country club. I wanted them completely comfortable in their fraud. I needed them feeling invincible. Then, once all the pieces were in place, I pulled the trigger. The county sent official notices to every homeowner in the disputed section. The notice was clear. Due to an unresolved and legally documented land ownership claim, your title deed is under review. Title disputes are active. Please contact the county assessor's office for further instruction. It hit like a bomb. Within hours, the Maple Ridge HOA office was swamped.
The phone calls started almost immediately. Panicked voices from terrified residents who thought they owned their homes, now faced with sudden legal uncertainty. Property sales were halted, mortgage lenders began flagging the neighborhood. The entire Maple Ridge community was thrown into full-blown crisis. And then came the lawsuits. One by one, homeowners who had unknowingly been duped by the HOA began lawyering up. The construction company, realizing their multi-million-dollar investment was now circling the drain, turned against the HOA. They accused the board of misrepresenting the land deal, of pushing a project they never had the right to approve in the first place. The local news picked up the story first, but it didn't stay local for long. Small-town HOA at center of massive land fraud scandal. Dozens of families at risk of losing homes. That headline spread fast. Kyle Renard vanished from public view. The rest of the board members scrambled to save themselves, pointing fingers at him and insisting they had no knowledge of the zoning irregularities or the land dispute. And me? I waited. I waited for the exact right moment to deliver the final crushing blow that would dismantle Maple Ridge's HOA permanently. The morning I filed the lawsuit, I knew their days were numbered. This was no longer just about reclaiming my farmland. This was about everything they thought they owned. Rachel had done her homework. Our lawsuit was airtight, a legal tsunami that would rip through their entire operation, leaving behind a wreckage of unpaid debts, lawsuits, and furious homeowners. My original land claim had now been officially verified by the county. That made our case not just strong, it made it undeniable. And the best part, they never saw it coming. I made sure of that. By noon, every single resident in the disputed area received a certified legal notice at their doorstep. Notice of property title dispute. Your deed is currently under legal challenge due to an unresolved land ownership claim. The property you occupy may not have been legally transferred. Please contact the county assessor's office immediately. Their homes, the ones they thought they owned, were built on land that was never lawfully theirs. Mortgages, insurance, property values, all instantly thrown into question. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Residents stormed the HOA office demanding answers. But there were no answers. Only panic. Homeowners were on the phones with attorneys, lenders, and real estate agents. People who had just signed mortgage documents found out they'd bought homes on stolen land. Sellers in the middle of closing deals had their transactions frozen.
No one could buy, sell, refinance, or insure a home in the disputed section because legally it all belonged to me. And then came the media storm. It started with the Clearwater Gazette, but within days regional news stations picked it up. Then national outlets came knocking. Suburban scandal, whole neighborhood built on stolen land. Homeowners in legal limbo after HOA land fraud exposed. Suddenly, everyone wanted to talk to me. Reporters, real estate lawyers, politicians. Because if Maple Ridge had screwed up this badly, how many other neighborhoods had done the same? I kept quiet at first, letting the HOA implode in real time. And implode it did. At the next emergency HOA meeting, the board tried to do damage control. Kyle Renard, missing in action for the past week, finally showed up. He stood at the front of the rec center, drenched in sweat under the harsh fluorescent lights, while an angry crowd gathered before him. These people weren't just upset, they were livid. "You told us everything was legal," one man shouted. "Our deeds are worthless," a woman waved a stack of mortgage papers over her head. "What are we supposed to do now?" Kyle raised his hands, trying to calm the room. We are working closely with legal counsel to resolve these misunderstandings. We're confident—" "Misunderstandings," I said, standing from the back of the room. The room fell silent. All eyes turned toward me as I made my way slowly to the front, a thick folder in my hand. Kyle's face went ghost white the moment he recognized me. I held up the documents. "This," I said, my voice calm but razor sharp, "is not a misunderstanding. It's fraud. It's illegal property transfers. It's zoning manipulation, and it's deception on a scale that's going to bankrupt this entire neighborhood." I let that sink in. You stole my land, built homes on it, and pretended like it never happened. And now? Now I'm taking it back. The room exploded. People jumped from their seats, shouting at the board. Some residents were in tears, realizing their life savings had gone into homes that weren't even legally theirs. Others turned on Kyle directly. "You told us we were fine," one man shouted, charging toward the podium. "You lied to us." I didn't,"
stammered, Kyle muttered. But he had nothing else, no explanations, no excuses, no way out. And then came the lawsuits. Within days, I wasn't the only one taking the Maple Ridge HOA to court. Homeowners who once saw me as the enemy were now filing their own legal claims, demanding compensation for fraud, misrepresentation, and financial damages. Banks began pulling out of the neighborhood, refusing to issue new loans on any disputed properties. Home insurance companies revoked policies due to the legal chaos. And worst of all for Kyle, the developer turned against him. See, the construction company that bought the land from the HOA had no idea they were stepping into a legal quagmire. They'd been promised everything was legitimate. Now their entire project was dead on arrival. Investors were furious, funding froze, and they needed someone to blame. That someone was Kyle Renard. The developer's legal team filed a $2 million lawsuit against the HOA for fraud and breach of contract, accusing them of deliberately misrepresenting ownership of land that was never legally available for sale. That was the final blow. With multiple lawsuits mounting, the HOA's finances collapsed. Their legal defense fund? Gone. Their reserves drained from their failed efforts to fight me in court. Within weeks, they were bankrupt. The same Maple Ridge HOA that had harassed me for years, tried to erase my family's legacy, was finally dead. And Kyle? He resigned in disgrace, but not before being personally sued by several residents who had lost everything because of his lies. But I wasn't finished.
because now that I legally owned the land, I could do whatever I wanted with it. After everything they'd done to me, stealing from me, threatening me, trying to bury me in bureaucracy, I decided I'd take everything from them. So I put the entire disputed section of Maple Ridge up for sale. Not the homes themselves, just the land beneath them. I made one simple announcement. The land beneath the homes in Maple Ridge is now for sale to the highest bidder. If the residents wanted to keep their homes, they'd have to buy the ground beneath them at full market price. Some could afford it, most couldn't. Overnight, property values plummeted. No one wanted to buy homes sitting on uncertain land. Mortgage lenders refused to finance them. The same people who once mocked me, called me a stubborn fool clinging to a lost cause, were now begging me for mercy. I gave them none. One by one, the homes in Maple Ridge fell into foreclosure as residents defaulted on their loans. Investors moved in, scooping up the land for pennies on the dollar. And when the dust settled, Maple Ridge no longer existed. The HOA was gone, the neighborhood was gone, and I stood on my reclaimed land, watching as the last of their luxury homes were torn down, bulldozed to make way for what had always belonged here, my family's land. I had won, and I had taken everything from them.
Worthless. The HOA board had lied to them, tricked them, and stolen from them. And now everything was falling apart. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed me, but I didn't stop to talk. I had work to do. Because while the legal victory was satisfying, the real revenge was just beginning. That very night, I sent out the first wave of eviction notices. Every single homeowner whose house sat on the 300 acres I still legally owned received a certified letter informing them they were now occupying private property without permission. They had two options: buy the land from me at full market value or vacate the premises immediately. It didn't take long before the former HOA board members started calling, begging for meetings. Kyle Renard was the first to show up. He slinked into my office like a whipped dog, his eyes sunken, his confidence completely shattered. "Eli," he started, hands clasped like some desperate diplomat, "there's got to be a way to fix this." "Oh, there is," I said, leaning back in my chair. "You could have not stolen my land in the first place." He swallowed hard. "But the homeowners, they're innocent in all this. They didn't know." I narrowed my eyes. "They sure didn't have a problem when you were stealing from me. Didn't have a problem when you fined me for imaginary violations, when you tried to erase my family's legacy. But now that it's their homes at risk, now it's unfair?" Kyle ran a trembling hand through his hair. "Listen, I could step down from the HOA board. I could—" I laughed in his face. "Kyle, the HOA doesn't exist anymore. It's bankrupt. You have nothing left to offer me." His eyes darted around, desperate. "If you evict these people, it's gonna look bad for you. The press is already on this." I leaned forward, voice cold. "Let me tell you something, Kyle. I don't care how it looks. I care about taking back what's mine." The next day, I started selling off the land, piece by piece, to the highest bidder. Real estate investors, commercial developers, even the original construction firm that got swindled by the HOA. They all lined up to make offers. Homeowners scrambled, trying to gather funds to buy the land beneath their own houses, but most of them couldn't afford it.
One by one, the houses slipped into foreclosure. And the former HOA board members? They were the first to go. Kyle's home, gone, sold right out from under him. He tried to fight it, but he didn't have a legal leg to stand on. I watched him pack his boxes and drive away from Maple Ridge. His life in shambles. The others met the same fate. Cara Monroe, the one who used to send fines for trash cans left out 10 minutes too long, cried when she realized she was about to be homeless. James Porter, the HOA's treasurer, he vanished overnight, probably running from the lawsuits piling up against him. And the residents, the ones who used to whisper behind my back as I was harassed, fined, and nearly forced off my own land, they were now begging me. "Mr. Walker, please, I'll do anything. I just need more time to buy the land. My family's lived here for years. There's gotta be a way." I looked them in the eyes, the same way they looked at me when they stood by and watched their HOA destroy everything I had built. And I said the same thing they used to say to me. Rules are rules. By the end of the year, Maple Ridge was unrecognizable. The once pristine neighborhood had been bulldozed. Developers put up commercial buildings, storage units, things far more profitable than cookie-cutter homes. The people who used to brag about their exclusive community were now renting apartments across town, watching helplessly as their old neighborhood was transformed into something they couldn't afford to return to. And me? I stood on my land, overlooking the acres my family had worked for generations, my farm still standing, my crops still growing, and Maple Ridge, it was nothing but a memory. Kyle Renard had spent years trying to erase me, to drown me in bureaucracy, to destroy my legacy, and in the end, I erased him. The HOA had tried to steal my land. Instead, I took everything from them. The last remaining HOA board member left Maple Ridge in a rusted-out sedan, everything they owned jammed into the back seat. I stood at the edge of my property, watching as the car rattled down the newly repaved road past what used to be a tightly controlled suburban utopia, now nothing but a hollow shell of its former self. Identical beige houses now sat abandoned. Their once perfectly trimmed hedges were overgrown. Their exclusive community, nothing more than another failed development project in the middle of nowhere. The grand Maple Ridge sign that used to welcome residents had been ripped out weeks ago, leaving behind only 2 rusted metal posts like broken ribs jutting from the ground. The HOA was gone, bankrupt, buried, and I had personally made sure of it. After the lawsuits, the fines, and the complete collapse of their finances, there was nothing left of their little kingdom. The former board members were now pariahs. Their names splashed across headlines and court filings, detailing their fraudulent land grab, their deception, and the financial ruin they had orchestrated. The same community that at once blindly followed them turned on them the moment their own wallets took a hit. One by one they were dragged into lawsuits, sued by the very people they had misled, forced to sell their homes, their cars, their pristine HOA-approved lives, just to survive. But it wasn't enough that they lost their positions. I made sure they lost everything. Kyle Renard, the king of Maple Ridge, the man who had led the charge against me, vanished. Some said he skipped town after his assets were liquidated to cover the lawsuits. Others said he was still fighting tooth and nail in court, buried under millions in damages from homeowners, banks, and developers alike. I didn't care. He was gone, out of my sight, out of my way, out of power. That was all that mattered. Some homeowners tried to negotiate, tried to plead, begged me for a way to keep their properties. They offered payments, tried to convince me they had nothing to do with what the HOA had done. I listened to every one of them, arms crossed as they stammered out their excuses. "We never wanted this. We didn't know they were stealing your land. I always thought the HOA was being unfair to you, but I couldn't say anything. Please, you understand, right? I have kids. They grew up in this house. Please don't make us leave." I stared at them, the same way they had stared at me years ago, as the HOA fined me, harassed me, and tried to steal what had always been mine. And I said exactly what they had said back then. Rules are rules. I sold the land out from under them without hesitation, parceled it off to developers, turned their precious backyards into commercial lots, storage units, and farmland again. A few managed to buy back the land beneath their homes, but at triple its market value. Their desperation filled my pockets with the same greedy exploitation they once praised. The rest, they left. They had no choice. I watched them load up their luxury SUVs, watched moving trucks roll down the streets of their dying neighborhood. One by one, they vanished, as their perfect little community crumbled into nothing. There were no negotiations, no pity, no second chances. I had shown them the same kindness they had shown me. And the moment the last of them was gone, I stepped onto my land, fully mine once again, and finally let out a breath I had been holding for years. The field stretched out before me, untouched by construction, undisturbed by entitled neighbors, no HOA to threaten what had stood for generations before them. The soil was still rich, the trees still standing. Despite everything, the land had survived, and so had I. For the first time in a long time, I could truly breathe. I walked across my reclaimed farmland, the dirt familiar beneath my boots, the air thick with the scent of wheat and earth. It felt right. This land had always belonged to me, to my family, to the generations who had worked it long before any HOA ever existed. It had never belonged to them, and now it never would again. The developers I'd partnered with were already laying plans, converting large sections back to agricultural use, just as it was always meant to be. Where rows of bloated McMansions once stood, there would soon be grazing land, fields of crops, and open skies once again. The town even approved a farmer's market on the south end of the property, a permanent reminder that Maple Ridge had failed, and I had won. The press tried to paint me as the villain, a heartless landowner who had destroyed a whole neighborhood out of spite. But the people who mattered, the ones who had watched what the HOA did to me, they knew the truth. The HOA had dug their own grave. I had simply buried them in it. I stood on my porch, looking out over the land that was finally irrevocably mine, and smiled. That evening, I stood quietly, watching the sun dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the land that was once again mine. For the first time in years, there were no HOA letters in my mailbox. No fines, no threats, no smug board members demanding I bow to their will. There was only peace. I took a slow sip of my drink, the warmth settling into me as the weight of total victory took its rightful place on my shoulders. And I thought about everything I had learned. Patience, power, revenge. They had tried to take everything from me, believing they were untouchable, believing that a piece of paper and a board of self-important suburban tyrants could erase generations of history. But they underestimated one thing. This land wasn't just dirt and property lines, it was my legacy. And no one, not a homeowners association, not a corrupt board, not an entire neighborhood of entitled strangers was ever going to take it from me again.